Hello and welcome to Grief at the Kitchen Table, good as part of the Good Grief Festival, a virtual festival about love and loss, and an event that seems particularly timely and appropriate given our current situation and circumstances. My name is Anya Morris. I am the founding director of Bristol Food Union, a collective of restaurants, street food traders and community food projects that came together to keep the city of Bristol fed during lockdown. And I am joined today by chefs, food writers and authors Valentine Warner, Olivia Potts and Nikesh Shukla. Hello everybody and welcome. Hi.
Hello.
Nice to see you all, albeit virtually and from a distance. Thank you very much for making the time to join us today. So we have all been invited here to host a conversation about grief and the kitchen table. So over the next hour, we're going to take you through a bit of a jaunt looking at our relationship with food, rituals and recipes that mean a lot to us at times of grief or trauma. We're going to look a little bit about dealing with loss, not just the loss of a friend or a family member, but loss generally, because I think we're living through a period at the moment where there's an awful lot of different sorts of loss around, whether that's the loss of financial security or the loss of work and income, or simply the loss of the lives and the community way of living that we're used to. So we're going to have a bit of a reflection on what loss means to us in the context of our relationship with food, and how food can be a key part of what helps us to heal, brings us together and nourishes, and how each family and culture and country has their own rituals and traditions in this area. In the first instance, I'm going to hand over to each of our speakers and ask them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their work in this area. Let's start with Valentine Warner.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm Valentine Warner here, and food writer. The last book I wrote was called The Consolation of Food, stories about life and death seasoned with recipes. A fair proportion of the book is written about my father's death, which it suddenly kind of struck me that the kind of book was a brain dump of all sorts of things, I think, to create space for the second half of my life, but also to finish some very long grieving for my father, who died when I was 24. It was very shocking to lose a father at the particular point when I was actually interested in what he had to say, having got through a very kind of, messy teenage time. My family were food obsessed, probably too much talking about food, but the food's always been at the heart of our family. We sat down and we ate 3 meals a day together around the table when we were with each other. And so it was hard for my father to suddenly be not sitting there. And just one kind of quick story, I've make some very short points, but just as he was dying, the week he came home to die, I cooked him a Keith Floyd dish that I'd seen on television, something to do with veal and langoustines and sage. And we carried it into my father, and he was kind of getting increasingly further away on morphine and said, I don't want to eat, take it away. And my mum said, you really, Val's made this for you and you really must eat. And he said, absolute rubbish. Me and all my troops have not eaten a thing between the Battle of Bosworth and the Battle of Agincourt, and we're all absolutely fine. And it was very, very funny, but it was very sad. After he'd gone, I think at the table it's always seen, how do you tell people you love them? By creating food for them. And we certainly sat together in the shock of my father's death. But I think what I really noticed is that to lose a father as a child rather than to lose a husband are two very different things. And I couldn't understand my mother's grief. I kind of understood my own. And I think so there was quite a lot of confrontation at the table. But I think that this is a good thing because things aren't always solved gently. And I think confrontation is healthy actually during grief, providing it doesn't cause increasingly more stress. At the time of my dad's death, I went into restaurants because cooking, being in a kitchen, is very frenetic. It's kind of like me. But it was a wonderful distraction. And so I think one thing that's very interesting about food during grief is for the cook. Also, when I got divorced and my children went to live in the Pyrenees with their mother, it was a terrible time to get used to this new change. And I cooked feverishly. And because it's a distraction, it's second nature, and it allows me to kind of escape from. So to create food was to be lost in something else. I think so too as a memory, because the food that I cook is often to do with the world outside our window, nature and the hedgerows and the woods. The kind of field is extended, made easier for me, because I get to go and pick stuff, the sea kale on the beach or nettles for soup or whatever it may be, to go fishing and catch a trout. So that grief is actually taken away from the table and can be taken outside into nature in order to collect food to bring back to the table. And I think to be in nature is also a wonderful way to allay grief, certainly for me when I'm looking for food. So that's about it. It's kind of a distraction. It's a gesture of love for other people who might be grieving. But a wonderful, so many stories come out around the table. And also when I cook, I think of my dad so much when I cook, because it's so much is about what he taught me that I can pass on to my children. He always had mushrooms in his pockets, always picking rose hips to make into cough syrup. And every time I bring those things back to the table, now that those painful times have turned into very pleasurable times of thinking about a departed father.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Val, I do have some questions for you, but I'm going to go through each of us and then we'll come back for a broader discussion. Olivia, moving on to you, your book came around specifically as a result of your mother's death. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your experience?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So my book is a half-baked idea, and it tells the story of what happened from the point at which my mother died. So similarly to Val, I was 25 when my mum died. She died very suddenly, very unexpectedly. But dissimilarly to Val, my family were not food obsessed. They were greedy. They liked food, but they couldn't. Mum was a decent cook, but not a cook who exulted in being in the kitchen. I'd never learned to cook. My sister couldn't cook. My dad couldn't cook. So it wasn't an obvious outlet for any of us when she died. And I found myself drawn to cooking and to the kitchen in a very unthinking way. And when I first started cooking in my kitchen, it wasn't in my mother's kitchen. It was in a little flat share that I was living in 250 miles away from my family home. I was awful. I was really, really bad at cooking and baking. I wasn't particularly trying to recreate her recipes, but I was definitely trying to distract myself. And cooking was an immensely successful distraction. It was a slightly different distraction to the one that Val has described, because I wasn't in a restaurant kitchen. I was in my own little kitchen, pottering about quietly. And my experience of cooking after grief and making food to share with people was quite a mindful one. There's a certain level of domestic cooking which requires you to concentrate just enough that your brain is engaged, you're not switching off, but you're not really able to think about the other aspects of your life that are perhaps causing you distress or sadness. And I found it an incredibly useful tool during my first years of grieving to be able to go to the kitchen and to cook. And as time went on, I then decided I did want to rediscover my mother's recipes, and it created a way for me to communicate with my family in a more serious way. We're a family of gallows humour. We would rarely discuss mum with any kind of seriousness. We didn't really talk about our loss or the sadness that each of us were individually feeling, but we just make jokes. But being able to talk to my dad and my sister about the food that my mother cooked and how I might recreate it and where those recipes came from was a way of tapping into our emotions that felt quite safe. And what this ultimately created for me was a new life. I went from having been a criminal barrister when my mum died to becoming so obsessive with cooking and baking that I left the criminal bar and I studied patisserie at Le Cordon Bleu for 9 months and then became a food writer and chef and recipe developer. And it's easy to look back with rose-tinted spectacles, but it's always felt like that is something that came directly out of grief and out of a way of trying, I suppose it was my way of trying to find a way through grief. And that this new, happier life that I have afterwards will always be tainted by the deep, deep sadness of its origins, but that it's something that has allowed me to communicate with my family and with my memories of my mother, and to see and manifest a future that is a happy one.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Olivia, I'm going to ask you one question before I move on to Nikesh. But if you didn't have a background of cooking, if you didn't have a particularly strong cooking, ethos going through your family culture in the first instance, what was it that originally got you to think about, picking up a knife and standing at the stovetop and making something?
I'm not sure it was any one thing. I talk in the book about absent-mindedly walking around my local Waitrose and picking up the ingredients for a fish pie, and it almost felt like an out-of-body experience, to the extent that I paid and got home and started Googling a fish pie recipe and realised I don't actually like fish pie. I mean, it was that thoughtless that I did it. But I had also started dating a man just before my mum died, who, and this is not a spoiler because it's on the back cover, ultimately became my husband. And he was a really good cook. He could bake bread and make marmalade. And I'd love to say that he encouraged me into it, but actually I just thought, if he can do it, I can probably do it.
Grief.
So it was more of a gauntlet being inadvertently laid down by him, and I snatched it up. But I think it was just a confluence of circumstances. I could be at this moment in a different life doing a grief at the carpentry table panel or grief at the florist. I mean, it was just something that captured me at exactly the right moment in my life.
That's really interesting. Thank you. We'll come back to you, but Nikesh, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. We spoke briefly before the panel, and you asked if it might be okay for you to share a passage from your book.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. So I've written a memoir. It's out in February next year, called Brown Baby, a memoir of race, family and home. And I didn't know when I first started writing a book about parenthood that it was going to essentially be a grief memoir and also be about food. But I seem to have written quite a lot about, my problematic relationship with food, my relationship with my mother and food. And I'm going to read two passages from the book. The kitchen was the central hub of our home, the main family thoroughfare. Your Foy and I ate in silence, listened to Mum sing along to Sunrise Radio and kept our eyes down. Every now and then my mum would stop singing so she could ask us about schoolwork, each question a pre-prepared torpedo aimed at the fault lines in our weaker subjects. We studied in there, shared snacks, prayed, laughed, cried, got told off, were praised. Everything happened in that kitchen. We'd reply in grunts and one-word answers, hoping it was the other's turn for the firing line. My mum kept the Rodleys coming, and we ate till we were full. And when we were full, we washed it all down with water before contemplating dessert. I remember going home in those 2 weeks. Mum was brought home from hospital, living on a ventilator, sagging in an armchair, unable to go into a deep sleep. The first thing I noticed was how the house didn't smell like the home I grew up in. The kitchen had become a shrine to takeaways and Tupperware dishes of well-wishing relatives. The fridge was empty save for milk and bread. No one was hungry, not even me. And I had a Pavlovian reaction to that kitchen. As soon as I saw it, I felt hungry. I spent years growing up in a bedroom above it, my music punctuated by bursts of pressure cooker and sizzling onions, the dull thud of Mum frying, boiling, baking, chopping, occasionally banging on the table with a rolling pin to alert us to dinner. Now that kitchen was like the perfect showroom for a family-sized space, imbued with flashes of memory on how things were and what they used to be. Each surface gleaming with bleach and polish. And then I'm going to move on a bit. Hoping for something disgusting in the freezer, I opened it, expecting to be greeted with a bag of frozen samosas and chips. These I could work with. These would temporarily take away the pain. The freezer was empty. There was nothing there, a bag of frozen peas frosted over with age. But there are two old, clear plastic takeaway containers. I opened one and am met by a familiar smell. It's mum's food, some bhajiyas and a container. This one has sweet corn curry in it. The smell is soothing. I can practically feel the coarseness of a cumin seed between my front two teeth. I don't know what to do. There I am in her kitchen, holding her food, clutching it like a second chance. If I eat it, that's it. That's the last of it. That's all there is. That's all there will be. No more. Only memory. Only a space where it becomes perfect and not something I tasted once. And if I want to experience it again, I will spend the rest of my life trying to recreate these tastes on my tongue. There's no way I can recreate her food perfectly. I worry that Indian food to me will become restaurants, and that one chana masala dish she showed me to make when I moved out after university. I can never get it to taste like hers. I could never instinctively recreate the amount of spices, oil, yogurt, cooking time. Each time I tried to recreate food in her image, it was too thin, it wasn't warm enough, it wasn't quite there. None of that matters with this Tupperware in my hand, throbbing like the Tesseract Avengers capsule for Infinity Stone edition. I defrost her food in the microwave for 5 minutes before plopping it into a saucepan and heating it up. As the food unfreezes, something happens, like a swirl, a whisper, a growth, a groan, a warmth. The kitchen swells with that smell of mustard seeds and garlic and cumin and turmeric and frying and my mum. It smells like my mum. It's like she's there in the kitchen with me. I wish I could wear this smell, just be enveloped by it, let it soak through every fibre and thread in my wardrobe. I wish that I reeked of fried garlic and onions, of the burnt pops of mustard seeds, of cumin and cardigan. I'll bottle it and spritz it on myself and call it my signature scent.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Val and Olivia, coming back to both of you for a moment, one of the things that came up as I was reading people's books was that part of the role that food took on within your families and during a time of grief was in part because you both come from quite British stip upper lip sort of environments, which I think, Olivia, at one point you were referring to endless cups of tea as one of the key support tools necessary for a time of grief. But I was quite conscious of this sort of idea that by cooking or eating food together as a family, it allowed you a window of opportunity, or almost gave you permission to be able to talk about things that weren't necessarily open for conversation at other times. So you could reflect on your parents through their food. Olivia, in particular, I think you just referred to the fact that it was much easier to sit around the table and talk about your mum through the context of the dishes that she would have made. That feels quite culturally different to Nikesh, with your Gujarati background. My mother's Irish. I come from a very emotionally outgoing Irish family, and death is all about, wakes and whiskey and song. How much do you think that role of our culture comes into play in terms of how we are or aren't allowed to express ourselves emotionally, and can we just reflect on the role that food plays in helping to break down some of those barriers? Olivia, can I come to you first? Do you mind?
Yeah, so I would say that I can say this, she's dead. When my mother was alive, when it came to the subject of death, she was incredibly emotionally repressed. Her father had died when she was young, her father who she loved very, very dearly. And I don't think that she had ever really dealt with or been helped to deal with that grief. And that very much informed her approach to death. So, and her approach, actually, more importantly, to grieving. So when my sister and I were brought up, we were sort of told that you shouldn't show emotion at death. Emotion was bad. It was probably a sign of weakness. My mother was incredibly effusive in her love towards me and my sister. We were extraordinarily close, but she had this hang up about grieving. You shouldn't even cry at funerals. You should be straight back on the horse. You should not be making an exhibition of yourself, I imagine is how she would have seen it. And certainly when she died, I was so shocked and so bereft that the way I dealt with it was to try and channel that, because I thought that the best thing I could possibly do would be to grieve as she would have wanted. Now, it's probably no surprise that is actually not the best way to grieve. It's a fairly bad, counterproductive way to grieve. And it took me quite a long time to unpick that and to deal with the grief that I had. I would say that we weren't necessarily as a grieving family brilliant in the early days of using food to talk to one another. We would sit at the kitchen table together, but I think we were all still quite good at not talking about it. The thing that made the real difference, I think, was when I started writing about the intersection for me between grief and cooking. And that then provided a dialogue, because obviously my sister read it and my father read it. And it was kind of out there in the open. I think I'd opened Pandora's box of grief and we were able to deal with it. So by resurrecting these memories of my mother's cooking in my writing, which was at that point just a blog, this was long before the book, and writing about my experience of learning to cook and why I might want to do that, it gave us a language to speak about our sadness and our grief together.
That's really interesting. So it's almost as if food gave you a vocabulary to discuss some emotional concepts that you may not otherwise have been able to broach.
Yeah, I think it almost made it feel delineated and therefore safe. We weren't going to sort of unravel if we started talking about it, because we were talking about it in this quite specific context.
Yeah.
And then slowly, we got better. We learned how to do it together and it became more expansive. But initially, it was this safe place for us to talk.
Val, how does that compare to your experience of the kitchen table, which could be both good for bringing people together, but also quite confrontational in terms of family relationships?
Very differently, because you use the word stiff upper lip, and that's not how I would describe my family at all. We talk a lot about everything. And also very different experience about death. My father was somebody who went to a C of E mass at 7 o'clock in the morning, but had believed in Buddha his whole life. And then when we were kind of in the woods collecting food, we'd talk about the chattering spirits of the tree. So he was kind of pagan and Buddha, And when he was asked the week before he died in bed, he came home for his last week to die at home. And he was asked by Mum, how do you feel about dying? He said, I feel very inquisitive. So the sadness for me is that the one day I chose to leave the house because I'd had enough of watching somebody die. He died. What helped me hugely was to go and see his body laid out, to actually go and see his corpse and to, kind of kiss his cold, waxy skin, which the rest of my family didn't do. And it was nothing to do with whether they did or didn't, but that was massively important to me. So I think the table really was about, it was this very difficult place about my mother's overwhelming grief. And then to give the three siblings experiencing, my sister had also lost, my father was her stepfather, and her own father had died before. So I think my sister had been through a hell of a lot. My brother and I were in shock. So it was a kind of place of wrestling almost. No one could it was very hard to respect each other's grief. So when food was put on the table, it was a godsend. It was because it's something that had been so central to my family. Both parents were brilliant cooks. When we traveled on holidays, it was almost as much to eat as to do anything else. So that when food was placed in the middle of the table, it became this kind of dummy in the mouth that we could all talk about the food and concentrate on the food. So it was a kind of an appeaser of issues rather than something that promoted talking about that person. And I think, when I do kind of visit my dad in food, it's, his scrambled eggs. He was so vicious about anyone who would ever consider putting milk in scrambled eggs, and said, if it can never be carved into the shape of a swan with your knife, then that's terrible scrambled eggs. So it's always scrambled eggs is the thing that makes me think of him, that it should migrate across the plate slightly, but not be glassy, and only be made of butter and eggs. And so my food and my dad is something different. And now with my family, at long last, I mean, it's taken me really till I finished that book to suddenly realize that I can say to my dad, I am not you. I'm different. And I think now I talk a lot with my mother now about my father, which has only really started happening in the last 2 years. And when do we talk about him? When do I talk about him with my brother and my sister? Is when we sit down and eating. But we've moved into something. It took a long time, and the last 2 years has food and my father now comes up regularly as we sit there and eat something delicious.
Do you pick up the role of cook in your family dynamic as well? Do your mother and siblings also cook, or is that very much a space that you
It's
take
a
on?
space, but I rather kind of regret in a way that I think we've all kind of been divided up into that's what my brother does and that's
Sure.
what my sister does. But I mean, left to my own devices, I'm a control freak in the kitchen. So, and it is also what my family do expect from a movie, because I cook nice food and they want to eat well. So that is the role I play now. But so much of that learning comes from my father, and also an ability to, I think, if I won't talk for much longer, but I think when I got divorced and my children left the country, I moved in with my girlfriend, Sasha, and she had a very, very small flat, which we used to call the backgammon board. And so my whole cooking had to change, because I was very expansive with kind of enormous fish and stuff that there was just no room for. So I had to start cooking totally differently. And that was a very interesting thing in itself, because that extra requirement to adapt to space more than anything in how you cook completely took my mind off what was going on when I wasn't speaking to my lawyer or paying his bills. So it was a wonderful thing. Food became, I just wanted to do it all the time, and It was very specifically to do with my divorce.
It's interesting. It takes us back to that kind of reflection at the beginning as well, about grief and loss not just being the death of somebody necessarily, but just the loss of significant relationships or proximity to our children on a regular basis, or that those things have the same impact on us. You and Olivia have both talked about cooking as a distraction, as a way of taking our mind off whatever we might be going through. Nikesh, you talk a lot more about food as a way of remembering your mother and maintaining that relationship with her, and learning your own family culture and family recipes. Oh,
Yes, I do.
you do, yes.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, because I never really took much interest in learning to cook until I moved out of London, and I don't live in London anymore, and I just suddenly felt very far away from my family in a period of mourning. And it was actually there was one day. It was around the time I was that experience happened where I reheated my mum's food, and I kind of there was some, if you read the rest of that passage, something transformative happened to me, and it became a resurrection in some way. It pulled me into a moment, and I felt deeply connected to my mother and to my family in a way that I'd never felt before. I and I realized that living in Bristol, the thing that just wasn't working for me was that my house didn't smell like a home yet. And so I got my aunts I'd phone them up, and they'd talk me through recipes on the phone, and they'd use words like tempering spices, and I'd be like, what the hell does that mean? And then I would attempt to make really simple dishes like khichdi, and then I'd burn the house down and sitting on the ground just outside the back door, sort of crying because like my house didn't smell like home; it smelled like smoke. And around that time, I discovered there was one Gujarati restaurant in Bristol called Tiffin's that used to do
I
all
know
of the food.
Tiffin's.
Yeah, so I think it's reopened now, which is really
At the top of Cottam Hill.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in Kingstown, and it was really amazing to be able to go in there and speak Gujarati to Jayshree, who used to run it. And I think the thing that I found in my grief was that you don't often know where the connection is going to come from, or you don't know what you're going to hold on to. And if I think about the kitchen in our house, the kitchen was what the one true communal space in our house. It was my mum's domain, but it was where everything happened. Absolutely everything happened in that kitchen. Like me and my best friend used to listen to like conspiracy theory cassettes in there, and my mum used to cook in there, and we used to talk through Street Fighter 2 strategies in there. I used to sneak handfuls of peanuts in there, and all the rest of it. And that communal space, it's always been like such a focal point in every single house I've ever lived in. And so moving to Bristol, I sort of felt like it was time to try and own that space a bit more. And so I've been on this journey to kind of learn how to cook Gujarati food, which has been really important to me. And I've found that I can cook, and I can cook that food, and it doesn't matter that it doesn't taste exactly how it was. And actually, Mira Soda's recipes are actually a really good approximation for what my mum used to make, and that's okay.
Tell me a little bit more about that relationship with your aunties as well, because in the book you talk about how your initial inquiries into how you might obtain those recipes or trying them for yourself were in fact taken with, they were a bit guarded about sharing them.
Yeah, so when on our wedding day, my wife and I were presented with a book of recipes from our family. Everyone had taken a page and they'd written down a recipe that they were known for. And in all of the Gujarati recipes, no one had any measurements for anything. And we were always like, what? How much jeera? How much haldi? And they were like, just as much as you need to make it taste the way it should taste. And I was like, well, I don't know what that means, dude. And so it was a lot of trial and error. And you kind of just found out that everyone had very specific ways of cooking, and there wasn't one size fits all. And so when my aunts would try and talk me through what they thought were really simple things on the phone, I was just like there with the phone clamped, hands just covered in gunk that should have been a dough to make rotis from, just going, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And they're like, how much water did you put in? You said to put in just enough to make it wet. I don't know what that means. It's definitely wet. And I think they were just bemused by me. Yeah.
Olivia, that's quite different to, we had a conversation about things being very controlled and measured and weights, and that there was something about following a formula and essentially being told what to do that you found very reassuring at the time. That's quite a different approach, isn't it?
Yeah, I think because I came to cooking with no real knowledge of it, I really couldn't cook. Like, I lived on supermarket pasta and supermarket pasta sauce and takeaways. Like, I was a 24-and-a-half-year-old lawyer in London who lived with two friends. I didn't know what I was doing. It meant that when I started cooking, I gravitated towards those recipes that are terribly precise. And that tends to mean baking. And then as I got into baking, I gravitated towards the more extreme end of that. And that's how I ended up going into patisserie at Cordon Bleu, because, you are measuring salt to the gram, you are cutting things up to the millimetre with a ruler. And I can completely understand why, to most people, that has absolutely zero appeal. But to me, I had no instinct. I had no kind of kitchen knowledge or common sense as to what was right and what wasn't right. So when I first started, I wanted to be told as precisely as possible so that I could follow it like a formula and effectively tick it off as I went along. And what I think I really needed at that point in my life was, this is probably where the real attraction to cooking over and above anything else came from, was to follow something and to get the result. And that felt like a little bit of anchoring in what was a very, to me, chaotic world and quite a chaotic head. But to start something and then 2 hours later produce, might not look quite like the photograph in the recipe book, but it was close, was really reassuring and grounding. So yeah, I quite quickly developed a preference for the more precise end. I didn't want to do normal cooking because that relied on, you seasoning it according to your palate, and I didn't trust my palate. I didn't trust my instincts, and it took me a very long time to build confidence in that area and to kind of know when something was wrong and know when something was right. In the early days, I needed a textbook, really.
Yeah. And presumably that magic combination of flour, butter, sugar and eggs to create comfort. I think sweet things as well, in particular when we're grieving or feeling emotionally vulnerable, have a really important part to play. I
think so, although it's just worth saying, it's also the fact that it goes from looking like nothing to rising. That is it's a really exciting part of baking if you feel like everything is hopeless. And as much as I love slow cooked meats and I really like brown food and stuff that's not photogenic and all of that, that is not doing the same thing in terms of it being thrilling, I suppose. And I needed something quite thrilling and uplifting.
Val, that feels almost the polar opposite of how I imagine you cook, which I would which I imagine is less to do with recipes, measurements, and more to do with a splash of this and a dash of that to create something marvellous. I have to ask you about that Keith Floyd dish. It just absolutely popped out at me when you were talking about cooking for your father just before he died. A scallop wrapped in Parma ham with a langoustine in the middle and a masala and cream sauce.
Sage in it, and then a sauce of mustard. It was classic kind of chaotic Floyd. But I think very differently I think again, and I don't want to kind of tie things in when they shouldn't be, but I think it's a part of my father that's with me all the time when it comes to cooking, is that he taught me so much about nature, to the point that my field guides, my flower books, my bird books, my fish books are as important as my cookbooks. And I think that what it was ingrained by him, which was that to be in a place before you're kind of making up your mind about what you're going to cook, and it's very different for somebody who was brought up in rural Dorset in the 70s, but it's how I cook when I'm in Norway or wherever it is. Stand still. What is around you? Well, there's some sheep nibbling the seaweed on the seafront who are then walking back through the juniper, and your menu is dictated for you. So I'm going to wrap the lamb with seaweed, and then I'm going to grill it at the end over the incense of juniper wood. And that's very, very specifically my father. That came from nobody else. And he kind of put that into me at a very early stage. And I knew, although I went off into the arts, I knew I was I was always drawn towards food, and it panned out that way in the end. But that was something very specific to my dad, which is that the outdoors brought indoors, consideration of the land that's around you, and you will always find something to eat, because his adventures across the world as a diplomat, and he'd be 104 now, my father, he was forever nibbling on strange things and drinking strange things. And I think that appreciation of the countryside and how you take the outdoors indoors is absolutely key to him, and a kind of pay attention, and all manner of deliciousness you'll find growing 2 feet away from you, etc., etc.
You have a beautiful chapter in the book that's about pleasure and pain soup, I believe you've called it, reflecting on. Can you tell us a little bit more about the incident that led to that?
I was indeed. I think when my dad was buried in Dorset, in a very beautiful place, Stoke Abbot, looking out down the valley, we were all in. My brother and I, and my sister and my mum, we were in terrible shock. And a few weeks later, I went back to see my father, and I sat on his grave and I ate some pickled onion flavoured crisps and drank a lemonade. And that night proceeded to get extremely drunk in the local pub with my friend. And but the drinking wasn't doing what it was meant to do. And I went home, walked home, my dad, feeling miserable. I came down to breakfast the next day just thinking about my father, and this kind of deadness, this kind of lack of reaction to what had happened, this kind of stony cold. And I saw a bed of nettles in the garden. And I walked into the nettles in my boxer shorts, and I just walked around in these very muscular nettles until I was so horribly stung. And the pain was excruciating. And I got in the car and I drove to the sea with this precise kind of feeling that when I got into the sea, anyway, that thing happened. And the cold sea mixed with the sting created this kind of, almost when you drink too much Coca-Cola very, very quickly and you get that kind of fizzing in the back of your throat. So I got this amazing tingling in my legs of the nettle bites and the salty sea, and it cured me. So from then on that point, every time I make nettle soup, it's now called pleasure and pain soup, because I can't make delicious vitamin-filled nettle soup. Great for lockdown, by the way. I can't make nettle soup without kind of thinking of my dad. So it's now called pleasure and pain soup in my family. But I wouldn't advise anyone with a hangover to go running around and stinging nettles and then drive to the sea, by the way.
I'm sure we need some sort of disclaimer there about not encouraging people. Nikesh, my last question for you, and then we're going to take some questions from the floor because we've only got 20 minutes left. I wrote down a quote from your book this morning that was so lovely. I actually sent it to my mother, and it reads, "This is beyond cooking. This is the alchemy of being able to smell and hear the house I grew up in reflected on the plate in front of me." There's something that's so interesting. I think a lot of what we've talked about is to do with recreating sensory memory as well. These memories that we have from when we're children and we're in our parents' homes, and there's the whole combination of taste and smell and situation and culture. They embed something in our brain that stays with us for a lifetime. How close do you feel like you did actually come to recreating something that was very specific to your mother? And in the end, how much did that matter to you?
I mean, I think it's one of those classic. It wasn't the finding of the treasure; it's the friends we made along the way style of cooking. I think my mum would have just been really happy for me to have been interested in learning to create these dishes rather than just relying on Tupperware. I think it's an interesting thing because I think so much of it is about heritage as well. Because, sorry, let me just gather my thoughts on this a little bit. But there's a degree of slippage that happens in migration where my parents, neither of them grew up in India. My dad grew up in Kenya. My mum grew up in the Middle East, and so that a slippage occurs between Gujarat and Kenya or the Middle East, and then they come here, and then a slippage occurs again because of access to spices and access to vegetables and all the rest of it, and so you think what of our culture are we retaining? Are we retaining the taste? Are we retaining the act of food as a gift or of provision? One of the things that you'll always find in a Gujarati household is that you're constantly fed from the moment you walk in the door, and that act of solidarity. It's that act of community of like feeding people. When people come around your house for a wake to do 12 days of praying when someone has passed away, you provide food for everyone, and so that act of providing food would have been the thing that my mum would have been most interested in rather than me nailing what the dishes tasted like. And so it was that communication of heritage that I had to kind of understand. I mean, if I could recreate, and I've written about this quite a bit, if I could recreate the roast tandoori chicken that she made once a year for Christmas every single year, A, without arguing with my sister about exactly how you do it, and B, without it being as dry as it always turns out, then I would be on to a winner. But I think the main thing that my mum would have wanted would be for me to just understand that food is beyond like taste. Food is about community ultimately.
Yeah. Someone online, we're going to take some questions which are being pinged through to me in the studio. And Nikesh, earlier on, you referred to your own relationship with food as being problematic. Someone online's asked, has your connection with your mother's cooking and recipes changed your relationship with food? And if so, in what ways?
No, I think I have a problematic relationship with eating my feelings, I guess is the colloquial way of putting it, and just eating terribly between meals. I eat very well during meals, but it's between the meals where I have the problem. And I guess my relationship with food has kind of changed a lot in recent years as food culture has, and like the idea of sort of street food has become really, really popular. And I've kind of it's kind of always just felt incredibly Western white gaze on food, and that's kind of changed how I think about it and talk about it with people. It kind of, for me, it's just kind of made me sort of retreat a little bit from wanting to ever write about it or sort of speak about it, other than what it represents for my family a little bit. But if you want to read about a potential eating disorder I might have, then that's all in the book.
It does occur to me that there is no area in our lives where our relationship to food isn't inextricably linked in some way, whether it's grief or pleasure or our shameful comfort eating in the quiet moments. There is, I think, just this idea of comfort from something outside of ourselves, something that has a sensory impact on how we feel. It's very interesting to explore how every individual's relationship in that sense is completely dependent on their own personal culture, family, socio-economic situation, all of that sort of stuff. There's some beautiful comments coming in from the panel, actually. Sitting here blubbing, but with a smile. This is just an amazing conversation. Didn't realise how significant it would be. We don't have names, I'm sorry, so thank you to the people who are sending comments in. Someone else has written, I invite my siblings every year in November, December to have a meal together and raise a toast to our family members who have died, a sister and parents. This year, my younger sister died during lockdown, so I'm not sure if as a family we'll have the chance to meet, but a timely conversation. Somebody else has written in to say, I've been recreating my dad's special fried rice. Haven't quite got it spot on yet after a year. Also, he had a knack of creating a dish from anything in the cupboard of fridge, which became classics in our family over the years. I keep trying to recreate those classics. And just one last one. I hadn't realised that I've been cooking Jewish chicken soup as a way of connecting back to my husband and ultimately his mum. This conversation's made me realise it's kind of a historic thing. It's just really interesting to know that people are out there in the ether somewhere listening to us. Someone's asked, what's the dish that most evokes memories of family mealtimes for you? And what dish would you like people to cook to remember you? Maybe we could start with Val and move around the group.
The all-inclusive one is that my mum used to make a jugged hare, which it would stink to high heaven while it was cooking and then suddenly become a very wonderful thing. And it had, kind of carrots and onions and wine and chocolate and red currant jam. I mean, it was a very but mum would make it a lot because vicious little brute that I was, kind of started hunting quite long, would bring these poor animals back into the kitchen. And the rule from my father was if it gets killed, it gets eaten, and that's all, your gun gets taken away. So we ate a lot of hare, which is an animal, by the way, I don't shoot anymore. But it was so delicious that my family we would all kind of immediately look in the pot, see how many guests there were around the table and start doing mathematics about who probably wouldn't have any more and what was the likelihood of being able to have seconds. And, we had terrible manners to some degree, but then it was so good that whenever people had been staying, they'd write thank you letters saying, and that jugged hare. And it was kind of my look on my dad's face was always when it was put on the table is, this is why I married her. And, one of the many reasons apart from her jazz singing and her crazy driving, but it was always happiness, that jugged hare. There was always thank you letters, and it was always great. We're having jugged hare for a Sunday lunch.
Marvellous. Olivia, I did tell you beforehand I was going to ask you about one particular dish, so I wonder whether this might be it.
It's actually probably not it. You were going to ask shepherd's pie, which my mother did make beautifully, and I still love a shepherd's pie, and I did reverse engineer that. But the one that makes me think most fondly of family gathered around is probably her minestrone soup, because that was both what we would have every Christmas Eve, and also what she would make when we were ill. So that was a much more ritualized dish for us. And that was one of the dishes that when I started cooking, I really, really tried to reverse engineer. And I mean, I talk about this in the book. I can't tell you how many recipes I tried and variations, and there were certain things I could remember about it. I knew like she chopped the vegetables into these neat little dice. I knew there were lardons. I could remember there being like a tin of tomatoes poured into it, but I couldn't make it work. And it was probably about 3 or 4 years after she died that my dad unloaded her cookbooks onto me. And she wasn't a big cook, so she didn't have loads of cookbooks, and they were all quite old fashioned. They were like back when Marks and Spencer's was St. Michael. It was the St. Michael cookbook and the Hamlin's all colour cookbook and that kind of thing. Anyway, the minestrone soup is Delia's. I have spent 4 years trying to reverse engineer Delia Smith's minestrone soup, which is what my mum had been making the whole time. So I can now make that, and I do make that for my family, both my husband and my sister and my father. I think although I sort of got into cooking and baking through the very high end side of it, it's not really what I'd want to be remembered for. I think I would want to be remembered for like something deeply unglamorous, like a really good stew or my crumble. Like I would love to pass that on. Like I make the best crumble. If I have children, they'll know how to make the best crumble. I'm just not looking at Val in the corner. I'm sure but something like that, or like, you know, a really slow cooked beef cheek stew, or just like a ragu or something like that. Something that is not beautiful, not measured in millimeters, but makes everyone around the table really happy.
Fabulous, thank you. Val, you forgot to tell us what dish you'd like to be remembered for.
Oh God, don't do that to me now, because I eat by my mood, and my moods change at least 6 or 7 times a day, and I have very precise hankerings according to my mood. So I'm not going to answer that because I can't. Because I can't. But one thing I would just like to say to everybody is that for the very things that we've been talking about today, I'm actually slowly compiling a cookbook for my children. That when they go to university, I will say to them, listen, you two, have a lot of fun, but make sure you cook, because if you're not a grown up if you can't cook, and also hopefully it'll be a nice memory when when I depart someday.
Nikesh, what's the dish that most evokes memories of family and mealtimes?
2 things. Once, so my uncle, my dad's youngest brother, used to work for a Japanese company, and every Christmas Eve they would send their employees home with a big sushi platter. And so just from the mid-90s onwards, on Christmas Eve we would all eat sushi, and it was amazing. And but I think just for variety's sake, like, you know, our family meal times, whether it was the extended family or just, you know, the 4 of us, it was always dal bhat shak rotli, you know, a dal, a rice, a shak, a sabji, and a rotli, but be it a rotli or a paratha or a tepla or something like that. And, you know, there's so many different combinations of that, but just, you know, in the compartments in the tray, that was always one of my favorites. And in terms of what I'd like to be remembered for, God, I don't know. I feel like we started a lockdown sourdough starter, because who didn't? And it turns out my kids and wife really hate sourdough bread, but so we're using it every Friday to make pizza, and we've become quite good at making sourdough pizzas. So either that, or I really like keema, and I either make it with lamb or with like minced mushroom, and both of those are delicious. And I actually believe that brown foods are photogenic, and not beholden to Western beauty standards. Yeah. So I would say mushroom keema with rice, brown rice, photogenic brown rice.
Good call. I like that combination. Is that the dish you'd like to be remembered for as well? Yes. Yeah. Okay, so we've only got 5 minutes left. That hour's absolutely flown by. I wanted to thank each of you for making the time to come and talk to us today. I think we're living through an incredibly strange time, and a time at which people are experiencing loss and grief in all sorts of different ways, even if it's just, loss of normalcy, or loss of the communities that we normally get to spend physical time with. Or, I was incredibly interested in why so many people were keen to keep a sourdough starter during lockdown. And I do think there's something there to do with that. It's something you have to tend to. It's a bit like growing a plant. You have to keep it alive. You have to feed it every day. You have to use it regularly. And there's something, I think, as humans, that when something tragic or catastrophic happens that causes a lot of fear within people at a large scale, it was very, very interesting to see the things that floated to the top, the things that really mattered to people. And what we saw was that kindness really mattered, community really mattered, and ultimately food really mattered. And the security that we get from knowing that we have it, even if that means people running off to the supermarket to stockpile, or the relationship we have that asks us to tend it and to be in relationship with it and to think about how it nourishes and sustains us. So but just personally, I found it very hopeful that when push comes to shove and times were hard, the majority of people found that family, community, kindness and their relationship to food were the things that were most important to them. We're not out the other side yet by any means, as we joked about before we came on today. We fear we may be the precursor to an announcement about another lockdown. But as we face this challenging winter ahead, I think it's very reassuring to know that it buys us the time, trapped in our houses as we may be, to really think about our relationship with food, not only how we make it, but where it comes from, how it gets to us in the first instance, whether or not in the field it's also been produced in a way that has love and integrity and respects the environment and the place around it. So whilst we're going through something quite difficult and traumatic at the moment, I do think what it also creates is a window of opportunity for change, and a window of opportunity for people to think differently about the relationship that we have with the systems we depend on and what they might look like going forward. I'm going to throw the floor open for just any last remarks before I tie us up completely. Anything that anyone else would like to say as we close? No?
Buy all our books.
So that was the last thing. I've even got a note on the screen saying, can I please flag the bookshop on the website? If you go to goodgrief.com, you can find a bookshop with all the books from our authors available. Nikesh, tell us when The Brown Baby, is it out already or it's coming out soon?
February 2021 it'll be out, but please pre-order it. And from wherever you want, but I really like Storysmith Books in Bristol. It's my favourite local independent bookshop, and they have a pre-order link on their website, and you can order it from there and support local high street.
Amazing. We even got a support the independents plug in there at the end. I'm very happy indeed. All right, thank you ever so much for the time, everybody. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone in the virtual world who we can't see today, unfortunately, but we know that you're out there.